Okay, today's webinar, Identifying Resilient Terrestrial Landscapes in the Pacific Northwest, is being hosted by the North Pacific, the Great Northern, and the Great Basin LCCs. Today's presenters are both with the Nature Conservancy. Steve Buttrick is the Director of Science Planning for the Oregon chapter of TNC. He oversees the Conservancy's GIS, monitoring, planning, and climate change programs in Oregon. And Ken Popper is a Senior Conservation Planner for the Oregon chapter of TNC. We're pleased you could join us to hear about their project to conserve nature's stage. We believe the approach they use to map the resilience of sites to climate change, which doesn't rely on climate modeling and downscaling, will be valuable to conservation planners interested in incorporating climate change in their planning. At the invitation of Steve, our 3 LCCs were involved in the project's Science Advisory Committee. So at this time, I would like to welcome Steve Buttrick. Thank you.
Okay.
And Stephen, can I just pass the ball to you? So hopefully you got a little pop-up asking to share your screen.
Did you go to the start? Yeah, go start. Okay. Here. Thank you, everyone. Just thought we had it all set here. Those that are not on mute, let me know if you can hear me all right. Again, this is Steve Buttrick. I'm the Science Director for the Nature Conservancy in Oregon, and Ken Popper and I are going to be reporting on a project that we launched in November of 2011, and here it is 2015, and we have now completed it. The project was to identify climate-resilient terrestrial landscapes in the Pacific Northwest. And I want to emphasize terrestrial, and that this is really focused on terrestrial landscapes. We're going to tackle freshwater and marine later. And the purpose of the project is to try to identify conservation priority landscapes that will conserve biodiversity in the light of climate change. And the project area is this area that was outlined. I apologize that it does not go into Canada. There were funding and data issues and timing issues, so we did not do that. It covers 227 million acres. We spent 3 years working on the east side of the Cascades, and we spent 9 months working on the west side of the Cascades and then redoing the east side of the Cascades. So we learned a lot during our first east side project, and we have scripted this work, and the scripts are available for download, and so if people have the necessary data layers, then they can emulate this work. I do want to, well, the agenda, I'm going to go through concepts and methods. That will be me. I'm going to try to keep it short. Ken will make sure that I keep it short. And then Ken is going to talk about the use of the products and the data in conservation planning. I want to first start out where we're talking about resilient landscapes. Resilience is a slippery word, and we're using the term resilience to refer to the capacity of a site or landscape to adapt to climate change while still maintaining diversity. So it has a large capacity to adapt. It sustains function and diversity. However, we do not assume that the species currently located at these sites or on these landscapes will necessarily be the same species present in a century or two. So why is the Conservancy concerned about incorporating climate change into conservation planning? Well, basically, we know, everyone knows, that as the climate changes, species are moving to accommodate those changes. They're moving independently from one another. And the problem is that we have done all of our conservation planning and set our conservation priorities based on where species and communities are now. And this is a map of our, we call it a conservation portfolio. It's priority conservation sites that were developed through ecoregional assessments. We do our planning on an ecoregion basis, ecoregion by ecoregion, and within an ecoregion, the planning is designed to capture all of the biodiversity within that ecoregion. We use a coarse filter, fine filter approach, which Ken, I think, will be talking about a little bit later more. But our coarse filter are ecological systems, and we usually set a goal of trying to capture 30% of each of these ecological systems within a portfolio. And the idea is that if we can do this, we will capture maybe 90 to 95% of the biodiversity. The species that we don't capture are usually those that are rare, imperiled, and they represent the fine filter. So we inventory for those individually. So our question then is, how do we select portfolio sites, or how do we modify this portfolio to conserve biodiversity, knowing that the species are going to be moving with climate change? There are a number of approaches that are being used, looking at vulnerability and the like. One approach, a lot of approaches try to predict where species will be in the future by trying to create climate windows for those species. It does require climate modeling and downscaling, and recognize that the climate modeling and the downscaling is getting really good, but it still does require the modeling, and a species-by-species approach obviously isn't very satisfactory, and we want to develop a method where a funder would buy into acquiring land for the future that would have impact in the future. So Mark Anderson, who is the regional ecologist for the Nature Conservancy in the eastern U.S., and his collaborators came up with a process for conservation planning and site selection that does not require climate modeling, as Mary just said. Instead, it takes advantage of the geophysical features of the landscape. This project was funded in part by the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. They felt, and rightly so, that if they are going to be providing grants to acquire land, they want to have some assurance that their investment will have a long-lasting impact on biodiversity. They really liked the products and the process that Mark and his team came up with, and they gave us then a grant to try to adapt and modify Mark's approach, which was developed in the east, to our landscapes in the west, which was a challenge. It took 3 years. The central concept is that by mapping key geophysical features and evaluating all occurrences of these features for characteristics that buffer against climate effects, we can identify representative examples of geophysical features that are most resilient to climate change. And I say this, but I want everyone to recognize that our focus is to do this in order to protect biodiversity. That is our sole focus. So this concept is really based on two premises, and the premises have fairly strong support in the literature. The first premise is that geophysical features underlie the spatial distribution of biodiversity, and a region's biological richness is due in part to this geophysical diversity. And there have been a lot of papers in the literature that point in this direction. But there was a paper in 2010 that was published by Anderson and Ferree, and they showed that they demonstrated that the total number of species found in each of 14 northeastern states and adjacent provinces could be accurately predicted. So the numbers of species in those areas could be actively predicted based on the number of geologic classes in those states and provinces, and they use these 9 classes up here. The elevation range within that state or province, and the latitudinal range. And that's an interesting fact, and the evidence suggests that although then the individual ranges of many species may shift with climate change, that the spatial pattern of total biodiversity may remain associated with the enduring geophysical properties of the land. And they also assert that conserving a full spectrum of different geology classes stratified across elevation zones and latitudes may offer an approach to conservation that protects biodiversity both under current and future climates. Now, that idea is not a new one. These geophysical combinations that we're talking about, in Mark's case it was mostly geology and elevation, he is calling them geophysical settings, that combination. Other people call these geophysical combinations enduring features, or the geophysical stage, or the geophysical arena. We are calling them land facets. Land facets is a term that is commonly accepted, I think, in the West. So such combinations of geophysical features are thought to provide the stage on which ecological systems function. And with climate change, species may move within and among these land facets, and the communities will disaggregate and reshuffle with the land facets as templates upon which new communities can develop and evolve. These templates are relatively permanent, whereas the species and communities they harbor are transitory. More and more researchers are focused on the value of using geophysical features as a coarse filter in conservation planning. This is a number of relatively recent papers, and in June there was a special section of conservation biology that had 10 or 12 papers. We contributed to 2 of them on conserving nature's stage. That's now what this work is being coined as, conserving nature's stage. So our idea is that by protecting a diversity of these land facets, it may be possible to protect areas that will foster a diversity of biota in the future, albeit a different biota than is what is there now. Just to put more meat behind that idea. Here, the stage, the geophysical features represent the stage upon which the players play out the play, and these players, of course, are species or communities. When the play runs its course, when climate changes, the species will move, players will move to another stage, but they have to have the stages in order to move to. Looking at the costumes here, I think this is Les Miserables. Not sure. Anyway, so we moved forward then and created a land facet classification for the Pacific Northwest. It took a lot of time to figure out what geophysical features and topographic features we would use to do this, and after a lot of testing and evaluating, we came up with soil orders, elevation, and slope. So there were 11 soil orders, including rock. We had 7 600-meter elevation breaks, and we had 3 slope breaks. And when you overlay all of those 3 together across the entire study area, you end up with 162 unique combinations of soil, elevation, and slope. It's interesting to note, although I don't think it's necessarily meaningful, that there are actually 161 or 62 ecological systems within this area too. Make whatever you want of that. So following a coarse filter, fine filter approach to conservation planning, we might want to think about conserving representative examples of each of these land facets in each of the ecoregions that are shown here. And you could consider that we would protect, in the same way we do communities, or focus on 30% of each of the land facets within each of these ecoregions. But which occurrences of land facets would we focus on? How would we stratify that? How would we select where to, which occurrences of land facets to choose? The conserving nature's stage approach suggests that you would choose those locations that are in and of themselves most resilient to climate change. They are locations that have characteristics that would make them more resilient. And that leads to premise 2, which is that topoclimate diversity and local permeability convey a level of resilience to a landscape or site. So we would want to find those areas that have the greatest topoclimate diversity and the greatest landscape permeability. So topoclimates are important because the actual climate experienced by an individual organism at any given point on the ground may differ dramatically from the regional norm, because the land surface features breaks the land up, or climate up, into a variety of topoclimates. And topoclimates are kind of microclimates minus the land to cover. So as climate changes, these microclimates offer options to resident species, and in response to climate changes, the species may be able to shift their location slightly to take advantage of this variation and stay within their preferred temperature and moisture regime. Our challenge, though, was to figure out how to convert these landforms into a direct measure of topoclimate diversity. Again, with the idea that the greater the heterogeneity, the greater the diversity of topoclimates, the more options a species have to move or rearrange at a given site. So we used 2 indices. One was a heat load index, or HLI, and this has been shown to relate to evapotranspiration rates and soil temperatures, and is a fairly direct measure of insolation. And our method relies on this index as a surrogate for relative local temperature. A high HLI value in an area means the area would tend to have a higher average annual temperature, and a low HLI value would be a lower temperature. We calculated HLI for every 30-meter pixel across the entire study area, 227 million acres. So we assigned an HLI value to every pixel. The other index was a compound topographic index, and that index is a steady-state wetness index, and its value is a function of the slope, upstream, contributing area, and has been shown to have a strong correlation with many soil properties, including the depth of the soil, texture, organic content, and moisture. Small CTI values are typically found along ridges. The largest values are in valley bottoms and basins with large contributing areas. We use CTI as a measure of soil moisture potential, and again, this was calculated for every 30-meter pixel across the study area. Now, we don't want to just know what the moisture and temperature is in a pixel. What we are after is diversity, variability. And so at each 30-meter pixel, there's a example right there, the little red dot here. We calculated the range of both HLI values and CTI values within all the pixels that occur within a 900-meter radius circle. we calculated the highest HLI values and lowest HLI values. We did the same with the CTI. And so in an area like this up here, you can see that HLI is probably, and CTI is probably very variable because you're on a steep slope, but we would calculate the largest amount and the smallest values for each and combine those into a diversity index and assign that index to that central 30-meter pixel, and then we would go on to the next 30-meter pixel and do the same thing. Ending up with a map of topoclimate diversity that looks like this. Brown, least topoclimate diversity. The blue has the most topoclimate diversity. We then stratified these by ecoregions, which I'll discuss in a minute. But it is important to note that, as I said, in order for species to take advantage of topoclimate diversity, they need to be able to move through the landscape. So we also calculated local terrestrial permeability. Landscape permeability is not based on individual species movements, but is really a measure of landscape structure, kind of the hardness of barriers, the connectedness of cover, the arrangement of land uses. We wanted to create a surface that revealed the implications of the physical landscape structure with respect to the continuous flow of natural processes. To do this, to assess landscape permeability, we used a method called resistant kernel. And for every, in this case, the central pixel is 90-meter pixel. For every 90-meter pixel, we gave it a value that represents how connected that pixel is to all of the other pixels within a 3-kilometer within a 3-kilometer distance. So we're essentially asking the question, to what extent are ecological flows out from that cell impeded or facilitated by the surrounding landscape, or how fragmented or unfragmented is the landscape within this 3-kilometer radius circle. And we did that for every 90-meter pixel. And just an example, sort of a zoomed-in example, this is the Snake River Valley in Idaho. This green patchy work is a lot of agricultural land. There are a number of river valleys with more agriculture and development. This is the craters of the moon natural area, and when we apply resistant kernel to this area, this is the result we get. So the green represents high permeability, the white represents low, very low permeability, and then there's everything in between. I'll just flip back and forth a little bit. And when you apply it to the entire landscape study area, you come up with this map. So the blue, again, is higher permeability. The low is lower permeability. To calculate resilience, then, what we did was for every 90-meter pixel, actually it was for every 270-meter pixel, we combined the permeability value for that pixel, averaged for that pixel, with the topoclimate diversity value averaged for that pixel, combined them together and mapped them out, and that defined our resilience. We did, as I said, stratify this by ecoregion. So within each ecoregion, we can see those areas of the ecoregion that are above average resilience and those that are below average resilience relative to that ecoregion. Another way to look at this resilience is in the form of a density map. And this map depicts the density of more resilient cells. So within a 3-kilometer radius of every cell, we counted the total number of every more resilient cell. We counted the total number of other cells that were also more resilient, and assigned that value to that central cell. It provides an important additional context when making land protection or restoration decisions. So cells with a higher density values are embedded in a larger resilient landscape. And those resilient landscapes are more likely to support biodiversity and ecological function over time in a changing climate. This is my last slide, and Ken is tapping me on the shoulder. And I just wanted to show people that this, again, was the extent of our work, and it was completed in 2014. Mark Anderson and his group completed the Northeast work, and that was completed in 2012. Work was completed in the Southeast in 2014. These were all funded by the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. Now we have expanded it to the Great Lakes area and the Great Plains area, and those will be completed in 2017 and 2018 respectively, and I think those are primarily funded, again, by Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. So now I will hand it over to Ken, unless Megan, there were some key questions that popped up that you would like me to address, or you can just wait until the end.
So far, no questions in the chat box, and I haven't seen any hand raises, so I say go ahead and go on.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to talk about how to use all that information, some of which we have done already, some are just ideas for the future, and then one very concrete process that we are starting. The first thing we did when we put all this data together was we wanted to take a look at our existing portfolio of conservation sites. You could look at existing protected lands. We took a look at our ecoregional portfolios from ecoregional assessments. To very briefly refresh people on the methods for that, as Steve said earlier, we select conservation targets. We set goals for those targets. And then we include a cost or suitability index that influences the choice of one assessment unit from another. And then we run all this information in ecoregions on the west of the U.S. We generally use MarkSan, and we run it all through MarkSan and create a portfolio of sites that meets those goals. The traditional ecoregional targets do take that coarse filter, fine filter approach, and the coarse filter consists of the ecological systems, and then we have more specific data, more known data on things such as plant associations and species aggregations, and then also have fine filter data on species. Plants and animals, we include all data, not just terrestrial, but freshwater as well, and everything from element occurrences on specific locations to species wildlife models. We put all that data into a program like MarkSan, and it meets the goals, and we get these portfolio sites, and they really, in a sense, show us how to get the most bang for our buck in terms of what lands to not only protect but also restore. They create that shared conservation vision and really point us to the best places to do biodiversity conservation work. However, they do not generally directly address climate change. And so that was one of the reasons that we did this project. And we first, with the data we created on resilience, we evaluated our existing portfolio. And the sites that are in blue here are generally the majority of the site contains land facets which are above average resilience. You get into the yellows; those about half the site is made up of land facets that are resilient to climate change, and then the browns are down at the low end. The reason that those might be at the low end, they might be centered around a large freshwater area, which wouldn't score very well here, or they could be in a more developed area, such as this was around that south of that Craters of the Moon area that Steve showed. It's a more developed area, but it's still important for conservation, and maybe restoration would be a important strategy there. So the next step was to use this resilience data to update an ecoregional assessment. And we decided to do that for the Columbia Plateau ecoregion. We took the southeast corner, southeast half really, of Oregon, and that is about 25 million acres. And we separated the landscape, the study area, into using HUC-6 watersheds, and there's about 1,000 of these outlined in brown in the study area. And we attributed all the traditional ecoregional assessment data to these assessment units. We also included land facets, and this is a map of land facets for that area, created as Steve described earlier. And we also identified just the resilient examples of each of those land facets. And so in total, there were about 90 land facet targets for this study area, this portion of the Columbia Plateau. And the first thing we did was to run these data with goals through MarkSan and to see how many assessment units were needed to satisfy the goals for the land facets. Both each just basic land facet and the more resilient example of each of those land facets. So we ran it through. We set goals for those 90 land facet targets. Those goals were met at 100%. And then the question was how much biodiversity was swept in along with those assessment units where goals had only literally been set for land facets. And so in total, this covered 32% of the project area, and 44%, a little under half of these 550 biodiversity targets had their goals met when just running MarkSan for land facets. So then we said, let's flip this and just set goals for biodiversity and see how many of the land facets are swept in. So we did that. This is the footprint of that portfolio. It covers 39% of the project area. It met all the goals for the biodiversity, and that includes those species, freshwater and terrestrial habitats. And then in addition to that, swept in was almost 80% of these land facet targets. So that was pretty good. It didn't meet all of them, but did a reasonable job picking up the land facets in this 39% footprint. And then finally we said, let's set goals for both sets of targets. We did that. This is the footprint. It bumped up only 2% to 41%, but met goals for all the targets, both biodiversity and land facets. So I'll step back here if I can, if I can do that. So that was the run where we just set goals for biodiversity, 39% of the project area, and then set goals for everything, and just another 2% of the project area we met goals for biodiversity as well as land facets and resilient land facets. So we were happy about that. And we are incorporating the results of this into the larger ecoregional assessment. I should mention that other ecoregional assessments we've done, updates in the Willamette Valley as well as the northern part of the Conilla Plateau also used information from this terrestrial resilience project. In general, this resilience information can really be used across all landscapes, both public land and private land. It's one of the nice things is that the data is really even across all land types and land management categories. And it can be used in conjunction with just about any other data set, whether it's something on species diversity or a statewide analysis such as a State Wildlife Action Plan. Here in Oregon, the permeability information that Steve mentioned was used in Oregon State update of their State Wildlife Action Plan, and it's also similar data is also being used in some of the other swaps that are being done, and so it's really available across the board. These results can be used and leveraged so that new projects, whether it's for conservation protection or restoration, are put through a resilience filter. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. We have found that resilience density map is a little bit easier for people to wrap their heads and arms around in terms of making sense of it and what the story is. It helps identify those large, above-average resilient landscapes. Steve showed a map of this a little bit earlier. Those dark blue areas are the ones that tend to have that more dense set of resilient areas. And the example that I'm going to get into now is actually something we're using for a land protection grant that we have received from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation for $6 million. It does need to be matched 5 to 1, so an additional $30 million in match, which will help protect underprotected and overconverted land facets. And we are prioritizing and mapping these areas from within which the actual sites to be protected will be chosen by using 3 data sets. One is conservation risk. The other is looking at ownership, both just private lands as well as ownership patterns. And then the last is, of course, resilience. So the first, looking at conservation risk, this is a map that's included in our report. The data set's available for download as well. And the areas in red and orange and the brighter yellow are areas where there is high conversion and low protection, protection being gap 1 and 2. And not surprisingly, they're in areas where you have more people living, where there's more agricultural activity. I'm now going to zoom into this Washington, Oregon, Idaho portion of the study area. Those areas that were in red and orange are now in blue here. So these are those land facets at conservation risk. And from these, I'm going to identify the private lands that are just the private land subset of these. So where are the protection opportunities? And that's that. And then from within this subset, I'm going to identify the subset that is above average resilience to climate change. So that's that. And this is the set from which we then mapped another density of resilience. So we wanted to know where do we have the most dense concentrations of land facets, and get the pointer working here, land facets at conservation risk that are on private land and are resilient to climate change. And so we mapped those as a density and created these polygons. And this is the first cut at the priorities for this investment protection on private land. Now, we'll need to narrow further, obviously, within these polygons, and there's a few ways of doing that. First, wanted to show that they really contain a variety of landscapes. For people not familiar with the area, this is Willamette Valley. We have oak savanna habitat. Up in northern Idaho is the Kootenai River Valley. Northeastern Oregon, the foothills and prairie north of Wallowa Mountains. And in the central Oregon, we have bunch grasses as part of the Columbia Plateau ecoregion. So one way to narrow down some of these areas is to say that important question of where is the biodiversity. We don't just want to protect the stage, we want to protect the players as well, the actors. And so in this case, we've taken Nature Conservancy's ecoregional assessments, some of which has been updated using some of the permeability as well as other data, and wanted to identify where we had coincidence of our portfolio, which is in large part based on biodiversity in these at-risk, resilient land facets. And so these areas in green really answer that question in part. For the RFP, which requests for proposal, which we will release in a few months, we'll certainly include other information that people have on biodiversity. We're going to include some information on adjacency to other protected lands, so where might additional protection add to connectivity from existing protected areas. It should also mention that that in the coming year we will be we're currently working on a regional connectivity project, and so the second round of this land protection grant will include that regional connectivity piece. That's about it. We'll have looks like maybe 10 minutes for questions. All this information that Steve and I talked about is available on our website. This is the short URL link to it. You can download the report there. We will have information on the land protection RFP up there in the coming months. And also in the next few months, we'll have information up there about a second grant, really a subset of the first one, from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation that will allow us to spend a total of $100,000 on outreach and technical support for this terrestrial resilience information, and that will make my time and efforts available to you all in terms of helping figure out how to use this data and incorporate it into your conservation planning. If you go to this website, you'll see that we have a brief summary of it. You can download a 2-page fact sheet, which is the quick 5-minute summary of it. And then on the right-hand side, we have a downloadable report, and then a couple of GIS data downloads, and some appendices, and then a link for high-resolution PDF maps of each of the maps in the report. So if somebody doesn't want to use GIS, they can just zoom into those maps. In the near future, we will also put the data up and make it available on a web map. And I think that's about it. Anything you want to add, Steve?
No, I think that's it. It is likely that we will put up all of these maps and what data we can on Data Basin within the North Pacific LCC Atlas, but it will cover the entire area. But we're talking to Tom Mewall, and we'll figure out if and how we can do that. We really want to make the information accessible and user-friendly. So that's it.
Okay, thanks everybody. So just a reminder, if you want to hop on the call and ask our presenters a question, you can hit *6 to unmute yourself, or feel free to send me questions to MPLCC staff via the chat box. So we do have some questions. I'm going to go ahead and start with the ones that we've been getting in the chat box. So first question is, does topoclimate diversity account for wildfire risk in any way?
No, it does not at all. In fact, the topoclimate diversity is the kind of the microclimate minus any vegetation cover. So if we were doing microclimate diversity, then we would be talking about climate underneath forest canopies and within shrub step canopy and that kind of thing. But this is just bare ground moisture accumulation and temperature.
And part of the reason we did that is that we do expect vegetation to change as the climate changes. And also, of course, anytime you have a microclimate map mapped on vegetation, it's already out of date by the time you actually are able to create the map.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, how are increasing disturbance regimes, example fires, incorporated in resilience estimates?
Again, I would say that they are not. And the idea behind the resilience work is to be able to have the stages that species can move to and or away from. I will say that, I need to say that what is really missing in this analysis is connectivity work, network connectivity. So we are calculating network connectivity right now for the entire region. We are working with Brad McCrae, who is a co-author on this, and calculating connectivity, both using CircuitScape and accumulated flow lines, I think it's called. And we will be attaching a lot of importance to those connectivity areas. Fire and other disturbances, I mean, they are really important, and they will change vegetation patterns in the short time, but we're looking at changes in the long term.
And there's no reason you can't include combine this information with a fire risk map, for instance, and use the two together.
Sure.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Have you found any biases towards certain landscapes in your high-ranking resilient sites? For example, one of the maps appeared to highlight high elevation sites that may already be protected.
Yeah, well, certainly the resilience information is in general lower, where the topography is flatter, because the topoclimate diversity is somewhat lower in level landscapes where you don't have a lot of topography. And that's why it was high. The topoclimate diversity was really low in the Central Columbia Plateau, and well, Columbia Plateau itself was pretty low. Snake River Basin, and topoclimate diversity and resilience is higher in the mountainous areas. And we also looked at threat. So as Ken said, we calculated the threat, which was based for each land facet based on how converted it was, or the percentage of it that's converted and the percentage of it that's protected. And certainly land facets that tend to occur at higher elevations have higher protection. than facets that occur in lower elevations and are on relatively flat terrain. So the threatened land facets occur where agriculture is a predominant land use and development.
And the one thing we may have not made entirely clear is not only was the resilience information stratified by ecoregion, but because it's calculated for each land facet type, it's stratified by land facets, so that we're comparing flat land facets against flat land facets and steep land facets against steep land facets. So it helps take that into account, and certainly some of the intermediate data sets did show a emphasis on mountainous areas, but by the time we stratified it by ecoregion and land facet, that was generally taken care of.
Excellent point.
Okay, so we did have one hand raise. I'm going to go ahead and let Ian, if you're on the line, jump in with your question if you still have one.
Yeah, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Great stuff, Steve and Ken. Fabulous work, wonderful TNC leadership. I think it's hugely relevant and exciting. I'm calling from Alberta. I work mostly with the Great Northern, but have colleagues in Plains and Prairie Potholes and in the North Pacific. And two questions. First, the obvious one from a Canadian. The LCCs, by definition, are transboundary initiatives. I noted that with regard to the future agenda on the Great Plains work under the Duke Foundation, that the grassland and parkland ecoregions will be rolled into the analysis, whereas in contrast, we have the usual straight line cutting right across the middle of the Cordilleras in the work that you guys have done. And of course, the kinds of issues that we're dealing with, whether it's grizzly bears, mesocarnivores, five-needle pines, fire ecology, native salamids, watersheds, we simply cannot achieve our objectives in the LCCs if we're doing it either north or south of that line in isolation. So the first question is, any connections with NCC or any ideas of extending this analysis so it's more useful to the LCC as a whole? And the second question is just around billing. We always sort of defer to biodiversity, and the first speaker mentioned that specifically. The reason that we're doing this is biodiversity, and I get that. And for those of us who are impassioned by that, that's great. But it's a relatively small portion of society, and it strikes me that the land facets approach, in particular, tied to the LCCs, which do deal with ecological process and function and whole environment stuff, that if this is billed right, the suite of benefits to society as a whole, we can get much more traction with the public, with communities, with public policy agendas. If we're saying this stuff is also speaking to recreation, amenity, quality of life, health, carbon storage, clean air, clean water, groundwater, not just the critters.
Both excellent comments, and I certainly agree with your concern about us slighting British Columbia and extending the value of this. It would be great to talk with you further about how to promote this work and promote the products for other benefits other than strictly biodiversity. That's simply our focus. But as you said, I think it can have a benefit to lots of different land uses and regional economies and the like. Regarding British Columbia, I have to admit I have a fondness for British Columbia. I got my PhD at the University of BC, and I think that it is definitely possible with some funding to extend this work into Canada. We were able to do it for the Canadian provinces actually in the Northeast, and I would like to talk to Mark Anderson to see exactly how he did it, what data sets he used. It really requires marrying the data sets across the international boundary line. So soil orders we used. I would assume that elevation models and slopes and that kind of thing would be fine.
Yeah, in some ways, creating the land facet map would be the easier part of the task. That creating a permeability map that crosses international boundaries is probably a little more challenging. Just even from province to province or state to state, it can be a challenge. Tying those together, but there's no question it's important to do so for a whole variety of reasons. It just, when this project started 4 years ago, that wasn't a focus of the funder, and we were under some time crunches and such. But certainly something we think would be a great idea.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go back to our chat box. Here's a really easy one for you guys. Is the map of biodiversity importance areas available as a GIS download?
We do have, the resilience, just to go through a couple things, all the resilience information is available on this website. This GIS data set has everything we've talked about. This GIS, much larger 12 gigabyte data set, has all the total climate information. As far as the biodiversity information goes, our ecoregional assessment portfolio, actually all of the Nature Conservancies for, I believe, North America, is available probably if you went through nature.org, or if you went to the Conservation Gateway and searched on ecoregional assessments, you would find those data. So that is available. Certainly contact us directly if you're curious about updates to ecoregional assessments and those biodiversity information in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, and certainly ecoregional assessment maps, portfolio maps are available. They are available on the Conservation Gateway, which you're looking at right now, and there's a separate website, right? Conservancy has a website, map website. No? Oh, no.
Well, yeah, there's a web mapping tool, and also just to go back, this information that's going to be part of the land protection grant that we have, we will be advertising this in the next few months. And the data that make up these specific polygons and these subsets of them that become our focal areas, those will be available for download probably around the end of the year or so on this via this website.
So the next question, I think you sort of covered that in the previous one, but other than the sites you mentioned you would upload this info, how will you ensure planners and others will access it?
Yeah, as you said, we've partially answered that. We're trying to make it available on the website. We're going to put the data up on a web map, at least one web map. Data basin is certainly being considered. And we may put together things like map packages. And there is that outreach grant that we have available, and people can, organizations can apply in the next few months. We'll be opening that up, apply for funding or just participate as a match in terms of us helping others use this information in conservation planning.
Great, thanks. Okay, we have quite a few more questions coming in here, so I'm going to try to speed through all of these. Next one is, how about population data regarding areas expected to see increases in human migration, such as the Willamette Basin?
Oh, that's a good question. You can overlay anything you want on top of the resilience map, and you can see the resilience is based on permeability as it is now. So it's based on current land use, current development, current road structure. And in order to maintain that resilience, managers would have to maintain an relatively unfragmented condition. And with development or projected development, you could lay that over the resilience, and you could see those areas that might not be good to invest in, even though they show that they will be highly resilient. If they're paved over, they will not be highly resilient. We have also overlaid climate velocity on this map, and we can find those areas that have high resilience and low climate velocity, which kind of is an ideal combination, and those areas that have low resilience and high climate velocity, which is a really bad situation, and everything in between. So a lot of information can be overlaid on this resilience map in order to, it's just a tool to provide more information to planners.
All right, next question. Are there any early indications that other federal agencies or land protection organizations may adopt these conservation priorities as their own? That is, what has been your initial success in elevating the analysis above TNC to engage the broader conservation community?
There's been quite a bit. Along the East Coast, Mark Anderson and a lot of people working with him, Nature Conservancy and partner organizations, and the Doris Duke Foundation, they're a few years ahead of us in terms of they've already had land protection and outreach catalyst grants, and they've funded, I think, somewhere on the level of a couple of dozen of land protection grants with a whole slew of NGOs and state and federal agencies involved in those. So there's some real on-the-ground protection that has happened because of this, as well as additional conservation planning. As I mentioned, some of the state swaps are actively using parts of this information.
Yeah, the LCCs on the East Coast have been heavily involved and really promoting the use of it and the value of it. When we did this work, we had an advisory team, and that advisory team included representatives from the Forest Service, academics, state agencies, BLM, I think, some NGOs. So they were all involved through this in helping us figure it out and come up with products. Also, we had a science advisory team as part of this $6 million grant that helped us to identify what parameters we should be using from this data in order to identify underrepresented, biologically important, resilient areas. And that science advisory team included each of the science coordinators for the 3 LCCs within the region. It included, what else did it include? Included Forest Service representative, included Nature Serve. There are a lot of people. So we're hoping to get the word out that way also.
Great, thanks. All right, next question is, has this work been ground truth with local folks who are knowledgeable about biodiversity conservation and local climate change impacts?
That would be great.
It would be great. We may use, we're checking to see, we may use some of the funding we have available to do some on-the-ground work. Certainly any of the projects that are approved in the land protection grant, there will be some ground truthing going on to check, are these sites truly resilient, that kind of thing. And then as Steve mentioned, the science advisory team that we had they were all familiar with the landscape in the Pacific Northwest, and I think they all thought we were going in the right direction and ended up in the right places as far as all the terrestrial resilience information.
Yeah, hard to QC each 270 meter cell, but do you think we could use the Catalyst grants?
We may be able to do some of that, and in part it depends on what partners contact us in terms of how they want to use the information, and if it makes sense, sure.
Yeah, this $100,000 in Catalyst grants. This is not money for us. This is money for you, users, and it does have to be matched 50-50, but it's going to be there and available for use.
Okay, next question. Is there an analogous approach being planned for dealing with aquatic ecosystems?
There is. We have identified this as a major gap in our information for the Northwest. There is some good information that has been pulled together by Meade Crosby at the University of Washington, and Mark Anderson, again, who led the charge with this Conserving Nature's stage, has also developed an assessment process for freshwater systems, and we will be looking at how we can modify that for freshwater systems in the West.
And I believe that the Nature Conservancy in California is also starting to look at this. So they're building out both the terrestrial and the freshwater portions eventually.
Okay, and I'm going to go back to the phone now. We have another hand raised. So John Mankowski, do you have a question in the room there?
Hi, I do. Great piece of work, gentlemen. I think this is going to really help a lot of managers get into conservation planning in ways that incorporate climate change without having to wade through the difficulties of downscale models and global climate models and all that type of stuff. So these resilience maps are going to really be important. But something related to the last question that we also hear from conservation scientists is that riparian corridors in and of themselves are important areas for cold water refugia for fish, migration corridors for wildlife. What correlation do you expect or have you seen between your land facets and riparian areas?
Although our analysis did not focus directly on freshwater habitats, riparian areas actually tend to score fairly well. That's partially because of the use of the CTI data, as well as just thinking about the way that the topographic data works. And when you get towards a valley bottom, you get side slopes, you get some steep slopes maybe, some valley bottoms, different types of soils. And so those areas score quite well in our topoclimate diversity and have a variety of habitats. And so we've seen that the riparian areas actually tend to score fairly well in this analysis, even though we are calling it a terrestrial analysis.
And of course, we can look at watersheds too, and evaluate which watersheds seem to be more resilient. The thing that would really muck up resilience in a riparian area or along a riparian corridor would be roads and development, and that would pop out as fragmenting features in this study.
Okay, and this is the last question we have in queue. It doesn't appear that this differentiated between native and non-native species. How do you see that factoring into the resiliency equation from the standpoint of biodiversity?
For our permeability information, we considered whether to use invasive species such as cheatgrass and that type of thing, but we really decided to keep it to conversion either from really hardscape conversion, roads and cities and urban areas, but also we included agriculture. So that was included if you consider that non-native. And then I think it's more when we include the biodiversity information, that's where when you put data sets together, you can really try to focus on areas that are in better shape for other reasons, or that have more natural habitats are in more natural condition, and that also include more native biodiversity.
So it's an important question. This work does not assume that people can just sit back and not manage the land and everything will be great. I think that the question regarding fire, how this might affect fire or fire affect this, is an important one. And these landscapes could definitely be impacted by fire, different kinds of land use that would tend to favor non-native invasives, annual grass, and those would have to be managed. There needs to be a constant effort to restore landscapes to native vegetation and to try to remove invasives where possible.
Thanks. And lastly, we just got a comment from Cindy saying that similar work is going on through Conservation Northwest, and a good contact is Joe Scott. Cindy, if you're still on, I don't know if you want to jump in and talk more about that. If not, I'll make sure to connect all of you guys together at the end. If anybody else has any more questions, you can go ahead and jump on the phone line using *6 to unmute yourself, or send them to our chat box.
This has been great. We really appreciate the opportunity to present some of this information, and LCCs have been involved, as I said, in helping to pull a lot of this together and direct it. So thank you all for bearing with us on this.
And I believe there's, for those of you that have friends that couldn't get in, because I know there was registration filled up, I think there's going to be another WebEx on October 14th, so keep your eyes open for that.
And that one, I think, is hosted by the Great Northern LCC.
Yep, you got it, and I will include a link to that webinar and registration for that in the email I send out after.
Great.
Thank you very much, Steve and Ken, for presenting today, and thank you, everyone, for joining the webinar.
Thank you, Mary.